In a small, peaceful town surrounded by hills and old houses, there stood a little music school with faded walls and big glass windows. Inside, the scent of polished wood and old sheet music filled the air. Every corner whispered memories of melodies once played. Some of the world's best students had come to this school just to learn from the great Maestro Rinaldi. Maestro Rinaldi was a man everyone admired and feared a little too. He was known everywhere as a genius pianist, a man whose fingers danced like magic over the keys. He wore fine suits, spoke with confidence, and never smiled without reason. Music was not just his job, it was his pride to him. Perfection wasn't optional. It was everything. If a single note was out of place, he would stop the entire performance, shake his head, and demand that the student play again until it was flawless. That morning, as sunlight poured through the windows, the maestro was giving lessons to his young students. Their fingers moved carefully over the grand piano, trying to impress him, but his face showed no sign of satisfaction. Again, he said sharply, "You play the notes, but not the soul." The students looked at each other nervously, afraid to disappoint him. Just then, the door at the far end of the room opened with a soft creak. Everyone turned to look. An elderly woman stood there, small and gentle, with white hair tied neatly in a bun and a warm smile on her face. Her clothes were simple, not fancy like the maestros or the students. She held a brown leather bag in her hand, old and worn, as if it had been with her for many years. For a moment, no one spoke. The maestro looked at her with confusion. "Yes?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. "Can I help you, madam?" The woman smiled kindly. "I hope so," she said softly. "I came here to play, if you'll allow it." The room fell silent. Some of the students tried not to laugh. They thought she must be lost or confused. This was a place for serious music, not for grandmothers with kind eyes and trembling hands. But the woman didn't seem bothered by the stares. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her steps steady but gentle. "My name is Evelyn Harper," she said, placing her bag on a nearby chair. "I used to play the piano, many years ago." Her eyes sparkled with a mix of sadness and warmth. "I stopped after my husband passed away, but lately, I've been feeling like I should play again." Just once, the maestro blinked, unsure if he heard her correctly. He had taught hundreds of students, talented, young ambitious musicians who dreamed of fame. But this was the first time an old woman had walked in asking to play, just once. He cleared his throat. "Madam, this school is for lessons, not performances," he said politely, though his tone carried a touch of pride. "Do you wish to enroll?" Evelyn smiled again. "Oh no, dear," she said softly. "I don't need lessons. I only wish to play one song, a song I once played for someone I loved." The maestro folded his arms, slightly amused. "And what song might that be?" he asked. "Something you wrote?" Evelyn looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her bag. "No," she whispered. "Something my husband wrote for me. Many years ago." The maestro raised an eyebrow. There was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, but he tried to hide it behind a half-smile. "I see," he said. "Well, I admire your passion, madam. But this piano is not for casual playing. It's a rare Steinway and a fine instrument not meant for nostalgia." The way he said that last word made some students chuckle quietly. Evelyn heard them, but she didn't seem hurt. Instead, she opened her bag and carefully pulled out an old, folded piece of sheet music. The paper was yellowed and delicate. The ink faded from time. She held it as if it were treasure. The maestro watched silently, unsure of what to say. The woman's calmness unsettled him. There was something about her presence, something pure, something that didn't fit in his world of competition and pride. "I don't need your piano," she said softly, looking up with a gentle smile. "I brought my own." Her words made the students whisper among themselves. The maestro blinked in surprise. "Your own?" he repeated, almost laughing. "You brought your own piano?" She nodded, and at that moment the door opened again. A young man and her grandsons appeared, pushing a small old upright piano on a wheeled cart. It looked nothing like the shiny instruments in the school. The wood was scratched, the keys were yellow, and one of the legs had been repaired with tape. The maestro couldn't help but chuckle. It was the most ridiculous sight he'd ever seen. "Madam," he said, shaking his head, "that thing barely qualifies as an instrument." But Evelyn just smiled. She walked to the piano and placed her hand gently on it. "This piano," she said softly, "was my husband's. He taught me to play on it, and it's been in my home ever since." Every note it makes holds a memory. Something in her tone made everyone quiet again. Even the maestro felt his laughter fade. There was a stillness in the air, a sense that something meaningful was about to happen. She sat down carefully, her frail hands resting on the keys. For a moment she didn't play. She just closed her eyes, and a small tear slipped down her cheek. Then she whispered almost to herself, "It's been a long time, my dear." The students watched, not sure whether to feel pity or admiration. The maestro crossed his arms and stood behind her, trying to appear indifferent, but inside, he felt a strange anticipation. When her fingers finally pressed the first keys, the sound was soft, trembling, yet filled with emotion. The old piano's voice wasn't perfect, but it was alive, and in that moment, without realizing it, everyone in the room leaned forward, listening, wondering what story her music would tell next. The soft sound of the old piano faded into silence, and for a moment no one dared to move. Evelyn kept her fingers resting on the keys, her head slightly bowed as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The air in the room felt heavy with emotion. But the maestro broke it with a low chuckle. He shook his head, half amused, half annoyed. "Madam," he said, his tone polite but sharp, "you have spirit, I'll give you that, but this is not a place for memories." His words echoed through the quiet room. The students exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Evelyn slowly turned toward him, her eyes calm and kind. "I know, Maestro," she said softly. "I only wanted to play for a moment," the maestro sighed, clearly trying to stay patient. "This is a conservatory," he said, walking around her piano with his hands behind his back. "We train artists who perform on world stages, not hobbyists who play for nostalgia." His voice carried a hint of arrogance. He looked at her worn piano again, shaking his head. "This instrument cannot produce real tone. Even a beginner would struggle with it." The students began whispering again, some hiding smiles. They had never seen anyone challenge the maestro's rules, especially an old woman who looked so gentle and out of place. But Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled faintly. "My husband always said a piano doesn't need to be perfect to touch the heart," she said. "Sometimes the sound matters less than the soul behind it." Her words caught the maestro off guard. For a brief second, his expression softened, but he quickly covered it with a smirk. Poetry," he muttered. "But music is not poetry. It is precision, technique, and discipline. Emotion without skill is chaos." Evelyn looked down at her hands, her thin fingers trembling slightly. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her bag again and pulled out that same yellowed sheet of paper. The maestro noticed how carefully she unfolded it, as though it were something sacred. "This," she said, placing it on the piano stand, "is the song I came to play." He stepped closer and glanced at the paper. The notes were handwritten, slightly faded but neat in the corner. There was a name, Clara's Waltz. His brow furrowed. "I don't recognize this composition," he said almost to himself. Evelyn nodded gently. "You wouldn't," she said. "It was never published. My husband wrote it for me when we were young. I was only 18. He played it for me on this piano the night before he left for the army." Her voice trembled. "He didn't come back." A silence spread again, deep and uncomfortable. The students looked down at their hands, unsure what to say. Even the maestro felt something stir inside him, though he didn't show it. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "But what does that have to do with this?" She smiled sadly. "It has everything to do with it," she said. "I stopped playing after he died. The piano became too painful to touch. But last week I dreamed of him, and in that dream, he asked me to play his song again. He said he missed hearing it." Her voice broke slightly at the end, but she didn't cry. The maestro didn't know how to respond. He rubbed his chin, pacing slowly. "You came all this way. Just to play one song?" he asked. She nodded. "Just one," she said. "And then I'll leave." The maestro's pride didn't allow him to show curiosity, but deep down something in him wanted to hear it. Still, he tried to mask it with sarcasm. "Very well," he said. "Let's hear this legendary piece. Perhaps it will teach my students what sentimentality sounds like." A few students giggled again, but their laughter faded as Evelyn closed her eyes and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers hesitated and then moved, slow and gentle. The first few notes filled the room. They weren't strong. They weren't perfect, but they were alive. The sound seemed to carry a story within it, a story of love, longing, and time lost. The room that had always been filled with sharp, Disciplined music now felt warm and human. Each note seemed to reach out and touch something deep inside the listeners. The maestro found himself frowning, not out of annoyance, but confusion. He didn't understand why his chest felt tight, why the sound of that old piano made him remember things he thought he'd forgotten. He saw his younger self practicing under his first teacher. The passion he once had before fame turned it into pride. Evelyn kept playing, her fingers trembling slightly. Her eyes glistened with tears. She didn't look at anyone. Her world was inside the music. Her husband's face, his laughter, his goodbye. The students watched in silence, completely still. The maestro had told them countless times that only perfection could move an audience. Yet here they were, spellbound by imperfection. When she reached the middle of the song, her hands faltered, missing a few keys. But she smiled through it, whispering softly, "It's all right," and continued. Her grandson stood near the door, tears in his eyes, watching the woman who had once filled his childhood with stories of music and love. As the melody grew, it felt like the old piano came to life. Its weak, broken sound turned warm, as if it was remembering its own history too. Even the maestro's heart began to soften. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Listening carefully, the final notes rang out, trembling and fragile, but they hung in the air like a whisper of peace. Evelyn kept her fingers on the keys for a long time after the music ended. Then she exhaled and looked up at the maestro with a soft smile. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it's ours." The maestro didn't speak. He felt a strange lump in his throat. He had spent his whole life chasing flawless notes, but none had ever made him feel this way. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Who was your husband?" he asked. She looked at him, her smile turning bittersweet. "His name was Thomas Harper," she said. "He was once a composer. Maybe you've heard of him." The maestro froze, his eyes widened slightly. Thomas Harper, the name of the man who had written the first piece that ever made him love music. The man he had admired as a child. He took a small step back, staring at her in disbelief. Evelyn looked down again, touching the piano softly. "I didn't come here to impress anyone, maestro," she said gently. "I came here to remember, and for the first time in many years." Maestro Rinaldi had no words, only silence, and the faint echo of a melody that had just touched his soul. The maestro stood frozen, staring at the old woman in disbelief. His proud posture softened as he tried to process her words. The name Thomas Harper echoed in his mind like a forgotten melody. That name had been his childhood inspiration, a composer whose music had once guided him when he was young. But he had never known what happened to Thomas after the war. And now, sitting in front of him, was his widow. The maestro slowly cleared his throat, trying to hide the emotion in his voice. "Thomas Harper," he said quietly. "I studied his works as a boy. He was one of the few who understood how to make music feel alive." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Yes," she whispered. "He always said music is a conversation between the heart and the hands." The students sat still, sensing the weight in the air. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. The maestro looked down at the old piano, still sitting proudly in the middle of his grand studio. It looked so small and out of place next to his shiny black Steinway. The contrast between the two was almost painful, one gleaming with perfection, the other worn and tired but full of stories. Evelyn ran her fingers gently across its keys. Her hands trembled slightly, but there was love in every touch. "This piano," she said softly, "was our world. My husband composed every song on it. It was the last sound I heard from him before he left for the army. When he was gone, I couldn't bear to play it. But I couldn't throw it away either. It's all I have left of him." The maestro took a deep breath and looked away. "Madam," he said carefully, "this piano is very old. The sound is dull, the strings must be rusted. It doesn't belong in this room." He tried to sound calm, but his words came out harsh. Evelyn looked at him with kind eyes, not angry, just gentle. "You're right, maestro," she said. "It doesn't belong here. But I do." Her words caught him off guard. The students glanced at each other. Surprised by her courage, the maestro straightened up. Crossing his arms, "You?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. Evelyn nodded. "Yes," she said. "I came here because I heard this place teaches people how to feel music. But all I've seen are people afraid to make mistakes." The maestro's face tightened. No one had ever spoken to him that way before, especially not an old woman with a dusty piano. "You misunderstand," he said coldly. "Discipline is what creates greatness. Perfection is the soul of art." Evelyn chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh no, Maestro, she said, perfection kills art. It turns it into a machine. My husband used to say that a single imperfect note played with love is worth more than 1,000 flawless ones played with pride. Her words hung in the air like a gentle challenge. The maestro stared at her, his lips pressed into a thin line. You think love replaces skill? He asked. Then why didn't your husband's work become famous? The students gasped at his question, but Evelyn didn't look offended. Instead, she smiled sadly. Because he didn't write for fame, she said. He wrote for me. There was no arrogance in her tone, just truth pure and simple, and for the first time. The maestro had no clever response. He turned away, trying to regain control of the room. Enough of this, he said firmly. You've had your moment. I think it's time we return to class. But Evelyn didn't move. She kept sitting at her piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. I haven't finished, she said softly. There's one more song I need to play. The maestro frowned. Madam, this is not a stage. Before he could finish, Evelyn started playing again. The room filled with sound, soft, shaky but full of warmth. The same melody as before, but this time slower, deeper, and more emotional. The maestro's words died in his throat. The students watched, wide-eyed, as the fragile old woman lost herself completely in her music. The old piano creaked and groaned, but somehow it carried her feelings perfectly. Each note seemed to tell a story, of youth, of love, of loss. The maestro found himself unable to look away. Something inside him began to stir again. The same thing he had buried years ago when he stopped playing for joy and started playing for applause. After a while, Evelyn stopped and looked up. Do you know what's wrong with your music, maestro? She asked gently. He blinked, caught off guard. Wrong? He repeated. There is nothing wrong with my music. Evelyn smiled kindly. It's beautiful, she said, but empty. It's too clean, too careful, like a letter that's never been sent. The maestro opened his mouth to argue but couldn't find the words. Deep down he knew what she meant for years. He had been chasing perfect performances. But somewhere along the way, he had lost the reason he started playing in the first place. Evelyn continued, when my husband played, he didn't care if the note was right or wrong. He cared if it made someone feel something. That's what real music is. It's not about showing your talent. It's about sharing your heart. Her voice was soft but powerful. The students sat frozen as if she were revealing a secret no one had ever told them. The maestro slowly walked closer. His proud eyes had softened now. And what do you want from me, madam? He asked quietly. You've already taught me more than most ever dare. Evelyn smiled warmly. I don't want anything, she said. I just wanted to remind you why you started. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint creak of the piano as it settled. The maestro looked at the woman, then at the piano, then at his students. He realized how different this room felt now. It wasn't just a classroom anymore. It felt like a place of truth. Finally, the maestro exhaled and gave a small nod. Very well, he said quietly. If you wish to play, then play. Evelyn nodded and placed her fingers on the keys again. Her grandson, standing by the door, smiled proudly. The maestro stepped back, folding his arms, but this time there was no pride in his eyes, only curiosity. As her fingers touched the keys once more, the maestro felt a strange ache in his chest. He didn't laugh this time, he didn't speak, he simply listened. Because for the first time in many years, the great Maestro Rinaldi wasn't hearing music. He was feeling it, and that, he realized, was something he had forgotten how to do. Evelyn sat quietly in front of her old piano, her fingers resting softly on the yellowed keys. The sunlight from the window touched her silver hair, making it glow like a halo. The room, once filled with chatter and whispers, had fallen completely silent. Even the maestro, who was always quick to speak, stood still at the back of the room. Watching her every move with unreadable eyes, she took a slow, deep breath, as if gathering courage from the air around her. Her hands trembled slightly, but there was a calm determination in the way she placed them on the keys. For a moment she didn't play, she just sat there, feeling the piano beneath her hands as though it were alive, as though it could still hear her husband's laughter echoing through its wooden frame. When the first note finally came, it was soft, almost like a whisper. The sound wasn't smooth or powerful like the grand pianos in the maestro's hall. It was rough, cracked in places, yet it had something none of those perfect instruments could create. It had soul. The melody drifted gently across the room, and one by one, Every heart began to slow down to its rhythm. The students who had been whispering minutes ago now sat frozen. Their eyes followed the old woman's fingers as they danced across the keys. It was not the dance of youth or skill, but of memory and love. The maestro's eyes softened, his sharp, proud expression faded as the sound reached him. He couldn't explain why his chest felt tight. There was something about the music, something real, something honest. It wasn't flawless, but it spoke to a part of him he had long forgotten. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound fill his head. The old piano creaked and some notes came out uneven, yet each one carried emotion. Evelyn's hands moved slowly, sometimes missing a key, but she didn't stop. Instead, she smiled faintly, as if forgiving herself for every mistake. As the song continued, it began to tell a story. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft like a whisper, sometimes trembling like a held-back tear. It was a conversation between her and the man she loved, between her heart and the piano that had waited years for her touch. One of the students, a young girl with brown curls, suddenly felt tears in her eyes. She didn't understand why. The song wasn't one she knew, and yet it felt like it was about her too, about everyone who had ever loved and lost. The maestro watched quietly, his thoughts running deeper than he wanted to admit. For years, he had believed that perfection was the only path to beauty, but now, watching this fragile woman pour her soul into every imperfect note, he realized how wrong he had been. He remembered his early days as a pianist, when he had played for joy, not for applause. He remembered the nights he had spent alone, repeating the same melodies over and over, trying to make them sound just right. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped feeling. He had replaced emotion with control, heart with technique. Evelyn's music broke through that cold wall. Note by note, the sound filled every corner of the room, wrapping around the listeners like a gentle breeze. The old piano, with its chipped paint and uneven tone, seemed to glow under her touch as she played. The air grew heavy with emotion, a mix of love, sadness, and something deeper, something eternal. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she never stopped playing. Each key she pressed seemed to open a memory. Each sound carried a story. Her fingers trembled more as she reached the middle of the piece, but her spirit didn't. When she reached a high note, her voice broke softly into the music. She whispered, "Do you hear me, Thomas?" As if speaking to someone no one else could see. And though no one answered, every person in the room felt the presence she was calling. The maestro's throat tightened. He looked away, pretending to study the sheet of music. But his eyes were wet, for the first time in years. He was moved, not by a perfect performance, but by something real, something human. The music slowed down, growing quieter, like the sound of a heartbeat fading. Evelyn's hands trembled more now. She took a shaky breath and pressed the final few keys. The notes lingered in the air, soft and fragile, like feathers floating down after a storm, and then silence. The silence was not empty. It was full of emotion, full of the unspoken words that the music had carried. Evelyn kept her hands on the piano for a few seconds longer. Her shoulders rose and fell as she breathed deeply. Her eyes closed, a small tear slipping down her wrinkled cheek. The maestro didn't move. He stood completely still, his face pale, his lips pressed together tightly. It was as if he was afraid that speaking might break the magic that had just happened. Finally, Evelyn looked up at him, smiling through her tears. "I told you," she whispered. "It doesn't have to be perfect to touch the heart." The maestro blinked rapidly, trying to compose himself, but the emotion in the room was too strong. One of the students clapped softly, then another, and soon the entire room was filled with gentle applause, not the loud, showy kind, but the sincere, grateful kind that comes from the soul. Evelyn smiled shyly and nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "That was the first time I've played it in 40 years. The maestro finally spoke, his voice soft and almost reverent. "It was extraordinary," he said slowly. "I have heard 1,000 performances, but none like that." She shook her head modestly. "No, maestro, it wasn't extraordinary," she said. "It was just honest." Her words struck him deeper than she could imagine. He looked at her piano and that old, broken thing, and realized it had done something his grand Steinway never could. It had made him feel. The maestro walked closer, placing his hand gently on the piano's wooden surface. "It's old," he said quietly. "But it sings." Evelyn smiled. "Yes," she whispered, "because it remembers for a long time." No one left the room. The students sat in awe, The maestro stood deep in thought, and Evelyn simply rested her hands on the piano. The morning sun touched her face, and for the first time in decades, she felt peace in that little music school. Among polished instruments and proud young artists, an old woman and her broken piano had reminded everyone what music truly meant. Not perfection, not fame, but love, memory, and the courage to feel. The last note of Evelyn's song still floated softly in the air when the maestro finally spoke. His voice was lower than before, almost gentle. "What was that piece called again?" he asked, looking at the worn paper still sitting on the stand. Evelyn smiled faintly, brushing her fingers over the music sheet as if it were something fragile and precious. "It's called Clara's Waltz," she whispered. The name seemed to hang in the room, carrying a quiet weight. The maestro frowned slightly, his brow creasing. "Clara's Waltz," he repeated under his breath. "I've never heard of it, but it feels familiar." Evelyn nodded. "You wouldn't have," she said softly. "It was never published. My husband wrote it for me, just for me. When we were young." The students leaned in, curious now. They had never seen their teacher, the great Maestro Rinaldi, look so unsure. Evelyn's fingers rested on the piano, and she smiled as her eyes drifted into the past. "I met Thomas when I was 19, she said, her voice quiet and warm. "He wasn't famous then. He was a teacher at a small-town music school, much like this one." Her voice filled the silence with pictures. "He used to say that music was just love turned into sound. He would play for me every night after dinner, sometimes happy songs, sometimes soft and sad ones. But Clara's Waltz was different. It was his promise to me," he said. "As long as this song exists, our love will too." The maestro's chest tightened. He recognized that kind of devotion, though he hadn't felt it in years. He had studied Thomas Harper's earlier works, pieces full of emotion and truth, music that had once made him cry as a young boy. "So this is his final song?" the maestro asked. Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes. The last one before he went off to war. He never came back. And neither did his music." The room was completely silent. Not even the sound of breathing could be heard. The student's eyes shimmered with emotion, and the maestro found himself looking at the old, wrinkled paper again as if it were a lost treasure. "I studied your husband's early works," he admitted. "But no one ever found his later compositions. People thought they were destroyed." Evelyn smiled sadly. "Most were," she said softly. "This one survived because I kept it, tucked away in a box with his letters. I couldn't play it for years. I couldn't even look at it. Every time I saw those notes, it felt like hearing his goodbye again." Her voice trembled slightly, and she placed her hand over her heart. "But last week I dreamed of him. He was young again, smiling, and he said, 'Play it, Eve. It's time.' When I woke up, I knew I had to, even if it was the last thing I ever did." The maestro swallowed hard. His usual proud posture had softened completely. He looked at Evelyn with something close to reverence. "Your husband was one of the reasons I became a musician," he said quietly. "His song, the Dawn Sonata, changed my life. I used to play it every morning before school. It made me believe that music could feel alive." Evelyn's eyes widened a little. "You knew the Dawn Sonata?" she asked. "He wrote that when our daughter was born. He used to say it was the sound of her first sunrise." The maestro smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I knew the notes, but I never knew the story," he said. "And now, hearing you play his waltz, I think I understand what he meant all along." The students were amazed. They had never seen the maestro like this. Calm, humbled, even emotional. He turned to them and said softly, "Do you hear it? This is what music is, not perfection, not applause, but truth." Evelyn looked down at her piano again, touching it gently. "Thomas always said music was like a heartbeat," she said. "Sometimes strong, sometimes weak, but always alive. He built this piano himself, with his own hands. He said he wanted to feel his music in the wood." The maestro reached out and touched the piano too, feeling its rough texture. "It's remarkable," he whispered. "Old, but strong." "Just like you," Evelyn chuckled softly. "Old, yes," she said, "but strong only because of love. Love keeps the wood from cracking, and love keeps me from breaking." Her grandson, who had been standing quietly by the door, wiped his eyes. He had heard her stories all his life, but seeing her play like this was something he would never forget. The students looked at her with new respect. She wasn't just an old lady anymore, she was a living piece of history. carrying music that the world had lost. The maestro took a step back, his mind still spinning. "You know," he said slowly, "if this really is Thomas Harper's lost work, the world deserves to hear it. It could be restored, recorded properly, shared with everyone." But Evelyn shook her head gently. "No, Maestro," she said. "It wasn't meant for everyone. It was meant for two people, him and me. It's our story. Our goodbye." The maestro hesitated. "But it's a masterpiece," he said. "The kind of music that changes people." Evelyn smiled. "Then it's already done its job," she said softly. "It changed you, didn't it?" He looked at her, stunned for a moment, then slowly nodded. He couldn't argue. She was right. There was a long, peaceful silence. The students were still sitting in their chairs. Not daring to speak, the maestro turned toward them, his voice calm and sincere. "Remember this day," he said. "Remember this woman and this piano. Because what you witnessed today is rarer than any concert or competition." "You heard truth." Evelyn smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "My husband always said music doesn't belong to the rich or the famous," she whispered. "It belongs to anyone brave enough to feel it." The maestro bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep respect. "Then you, madam," he said softly, "are the bravest musician I've ever met." Evelyn chuckled through her tears. "No, maestro," she said. "I'm just a woman who finally stopped being afraid to remember." The old piano stood quietly beside her, its scratched surface glowing softly in the light. For the first time in years, it had sung again. And not just a song, but a story of love, loss, and the music that lives forever in the heart. And as the maestro looked at her one last time, he knew he would never forget that moment. The day an old woman and her broken piano taught him what it truly meant to play from the soul. The room was so silent that even the sound of breathing felt loud. The last note of Clara's waltz still floated gently in the air, fading like a memory that refused to die. Evelyn sat still at her piano, her thin fingers resting on the keys. Her eyes were closed and a soft smile curved her lips. It was a smile full of love, loss, and peace all at once. The maestro couldn't move. His throat felt tight. His heart beat slower than usual. He had listened to countless performances in his life, from the greatest halls of Europe to the most talented students in the world. But none had ever made him feel like this. There was something in that simple song that had broken open a door inside him. A door he didn't even know was locked. Evelyn slowly opened her eyes and looked around. The sunlight streaming through the window fell on her face, making her eyes sparkle with tears. The students were still frozen in their seats, their faces pale with awe. Even the youngest one, who had been giggling earlier, was now staring with wet eyes. The maestro finally took a step forward. His shoes clicked softly on the floor. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to come out. His pride, which once filled every room he entered, had completely vanished. He looked at her, this gentle, wrinkled woman sitting by her broken piano, and felt smaller than he ever had before. Evelyn lifted her trembling hand and wiped a tear that rolled down her cheek. "I didn't think I could do it," she whispered softly. "I thought my hands would fail me, but I felt him here, right beside me, guiding every note." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her palm gently against her heart. I could almost hear him breathe again. Her grandson stepped closer and put a hand on her shoulder. His eyes were red, but he was smiling proudly. "Grandma," he said quietly, "he would be so proud of you." Evelyn nodded. Unable to speak for a moment, she took a shaky breath and smiled again. "I know, darling," she said softly. "I could feel it." The maestro swallowed hard and looked away, pretending to adjust his cuff, but a single tear slipped from his eye. He quickly brushed it away, hoping no one saw. He was a man known for control, but right now he felt none. The music had touched something deep, something raw, something real. He slowly approached her, his voice soft, almost breaking. "Madam," he said, I don't know what to say." Evelyn looked up, her eyes kind. "Then don't say anything." "Maestro," she said, "just feel it." Her words hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, he thought of all the times he had scolded his students for small mistakes, all the times he had shouted that emotion was worthless without perfection. But now, standing before this fragile old woman who had just bared her soul through imperfect notes, he realized how wrong he had been all along. He knelt beside her piano, running his hand over the scratched wood. "This piano," he whispered. "It's been through so much, hasn't it?" Evelyn chuckled softly. "Oh yes," she said. "It's old, tired, and stubborn like me." Then her smile softened. "But it still remembers how to sing." The maestro smiled faintly. "And what a song it was," he said quietly. "I've heard the finest players in the world, but none have ever played like that." Evelyn shook her head gently. "I didn't play for the world," she said. "I played for love." Her words stayed in the air like the final line of a poem. The maestro nodded slowly, understanding completely. He stood up, his voice trembling slightly. "You've taught me more in 1 hour than I've learned in 40 years, he said. "You reminded me that music isn't about showing skill. It's about showing heart," Evelyn smiled warmly. "Thomas used to tell me that too," she said. "He said music without feeling is just noise, and life without love is silence." The maestro turned toward his students, who were all watching silently. "Do you see?" he said softly. "Do you finally understand what I've been trying to teach you all this time? It's not the fingers that make music, it's the soul." One by one, the students nodded, some wiping their eyes. The young girl who had cried earlier whispered, "She played like she was talking to someone she missed." Evelyn heard and smiled at her. "That's exactly what I was doing, sweetheart," she said gently. The maestro looked back at her. "You've given us a gift," he said, "something none of us will ever forget." Evelyn laughed softly. "Then it was worth the walk up those stairs," she said with a wink, making everyone in the room smile through their tears. The tension broke for a moment, and a few of the students chuckled quietly, but the warmth stayed. The maestro's eyes fell once more on the old sheet of music still resting on the stand. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward it. Evelyn nodded, and he picked it up carefully, as if it were made of glass. He studied the faded ink and uneven handwriting. "He wrote this by hand," he said softly. "You can feel the emotion in every line. It's beautiful." Evelyn nodded. "He never believed in perfection either," she said. "He said the mistakes are what make the song human." The maestro looked up at her and smiled. "Then it's the most human song I've ever heard," he said sincerely. Evelyn looked down at her hands again. "I was so afraid to play it," she admitted. "I thought I would break down halfway. I thought my hands would forget. But when I touched the keys, it was like he was there again. Every note reminded me of him, his laugh, his voice, his promise. I felt young again. Just for a moment." Tears filled her eyes once more. But this time they weren't from sadness. They were from peace. "I think now," she said softly, "I can finally rest. I've kept his song alive one more time." The maestro's heart ached at her words. He bowed his head respectfully. "No, Mrs. Harper," he said gently. "You didn't just keep it alive, you brought it back to life." She looked at him with watery eyes. "Thank you, Maestro," she said. "But it wasn't me, it was love. It never really dies, you know. It just waits for the right song." He smiled, unable to argue. "Then I think you just reminded us all how to listen," he said quietly. The room remained still, the kind of silence that feels sacred. The students didn't want to move, afraid they'd break the spell. The old piano, scratched and worn, seemed to glow softly in the morning light. Evelyn ran her hand along its top one last time, whispering, "Thank you, old friend." Her grandson took her arm gently, helping her to stand. The maestro bowed deeply before her, something he had never done for any performer, and for the first time in many years tears rolled freely down his face, not from sorrow, but from gratitude. He had finally remembered why he fell in love with music, not for perfection, not for fame, but for moments like this, moments that made the heart tremble and the soul sing. In that quiet room among students and silence, an old woman had turned grief into beauty, and her music had done what perfection never could. It had made even the maestro cry. The sun had begun to move lower in the sky, sending warm light through the tall windows of the music school. The golden rays landed on Evelyn's old piano, making its scratched wood glow softly. It looked almost magical now, as if the light itself wanted to honor what had just happened. The students were still sitting in silence, some holding back tears, others staring at Evelyn like she was a piece of living history. Maestro Rinaldi stood near her, lost in thought. His usual sharp and confident face looked softer, more human. The old woman had done something no student, no performer had ever done to him. She had reached his heart. He kept hearing the notes of Clara's waltz in his head. Over and over, it wasn't just a song anymore. It was a feeling, a story, a memory. He finally spoke, his voice gentle and full of respect. "Mrs. Harper," he said quietly, "I must tell you something. I have listened to thousands of pianists in my life, but today for the first time I heard music. Real music." Evelyn looked at him and smiled. "Oh, Maestro," she said softly. "I'm sure you've heard real music many times." He shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "I've heard performances, I've heard skill, but what you gave us was something else. You gave us truth." She chuckled, wiping her tears. "It wasn't truth, my dear, it was just love. Love always finds its way through music, even when the notes are old and broken." The maestro nodded slowly, then looked down at her piano again. He touched the edge of the wooden frame, feeling its worn texture. "This piano," he said thoughtfully. "It deserves more than this. It deserves to be remembered just like your husband. Allow me to have it restored. I will make sure it sings again, beautifully." "For generations," Evelyn's eyes widened a little. "Restored?" she repeated. "But why?" The maestro smiled softly. "Because it's special," he said. "Because it carries the spirit of a man who loved deeply, and the woman who kept that love alive. This piano is history, and it should never be forgotten." Her hands trembled as she touched the old keys. "You would really do that?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "For me?" He shook his head. "Not for you," he said kindly. "For him, and for every person who has ever played music for love, not fame." The students exchanged glances, their eyes shining with admiration. None of them had ever seen their teacher so humble, so gentle. Evelyn smiled with tears in her eyes. "You're very kind, Maestro," she said. "But I don't need it restored. It's perfect the way it is." The maestro frowned slightly. "Perfect?" "But the sound," she interrupted softly. "The sound tells my story. Every scratch, every creak, every broken note, they are all part of my life. If you make it new again, it won't remember me anymore." Her words hit him hard. He opened his mouth but couldn't find a reply. The room fell silent again. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. After a moment, Evelyn smiled kindly. "But I do want to record the song," she said. "Not for fame or money, but for my grandson. And maybe for anyone who still believes that love never dies." The maestro's face softened even more. "Then I will record it myself," he said firmly. "We'll make sure your husband's waltz is heard by the world. Not as a performance, but as a message." Evelyn looked at him curiously. "And what message would that be?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "That perfection is nothing without heart," he said, "and that the most beautiful music comes from pain, love, and memory." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "Thomas would have liked that," she said quietly. "He always said music doesn't belong in fancy halls, it belongs in kitchens, in gardens, in the hearts of people who feel deeply." The maestro smiled at her words, realizing how right she was. He had spent so many years chasing fame, applause, and flawless technique that he had forgotten the simplest truth. Music was never meant to impress. It was meant to connect. Evelyn sighed softly. "I never thought I'd play in front of people again," she said. "I thought no one would care to listen to an old woman with shaking hands, but you listened, all of you. And that means more to me than you can imagine." Her grandson placed a loving arm around her shoulders. "Everyone should have heard you, Grandma," he said proudly. "You were amazing." The maestro turned to his students. "Do you see, my friends?" he said, his voice full of emotion. "You spend hours trying to play the right notes, but you forget to feel them. You forget to breathe between them. That's what she just taught us, that music is not in the fingers. It's in the soul." The students nodded silently, several of them wiping away tears. They had learned something that no textbook or lesson could ever teach them. Evelyn smiled at them all. "Don't be afraid to make mistakes," she said softly. "Sometimes the wrong note can lead you to the right feeling." The maestro chuckled lightly. "I think I will be quoting you in my future classes." "Mrs. Harper," he said warmly. She smiled back. "Then make sure you tell them to play with their hearts, not just their hands," he nodded. "I promise," he said, and for once, his words sounded like more than politeness. They sounded like truth. Evelyn slowly stood up, her grandson helping her. She looked around the room one last time, her eyes falling on the students, then on the maestro. "Thank you," she said softly, "for letting me play, for letting me remember." The maestro bowed deeply, something he rarely did for anyone. "No, Mrs. Harper," he said quietly. "Thank you for reminding us why we play at all." For a few seconds, No one spoke. The sun shone brighter through the window. The room filled with golden light and the air felt warm, peaceful, alive. As Evelyn turned to leave, the maestro called out gently, "Mrs. Harper." She turned back, smiling. "Yes, maestro." He looked at her piano again, then met her eyes. "If music is love, then today you've made us all fall in love again." Evelyn's smile deepened, her eyes glistening. "Then my husband's song did its job," she said softly. The maestro bowed once more, and Evelyn and her grandson slowly walked out, the sound of their footsteps fading down the hallway. The maestro stood quietly for a long time after they left, staring at the piano, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He finally turned to his students and whispered, "We will never forget this day," and they didn't. For that one afternoon in that small music room, an old woman and her dusty piano had changed every heart, reminding them that true music is not found in perfection, but in love, memory, and the courage to feel again. A few weeks passed since that unforgettable day in the maestro's music room, but the memory of Evelyn Harper and her old piano still lingered in everyone's heart. The students often whispered about it between lessons, saying how that simple performance had changed the way they saw music. Even the maestro, once so proud and strict, had become quieter, softer, more thoughtful. He no longer shouted when someone missed a note. Instead, he would close his eyes and ask, "What are you trying to say with this song?" Something had changed inside him. Every time he touched his piano, he thought of Evelyn, the gentle way she played, the honesty in her music, and the tears that had filled the room. He realized that she hadn't just played a song. She had opened a door to something greater, something human, something eternal. One morning, the maestro sat alone at his desk, holding the faded sheet of music Evelyn had left behind. Clara's waltz, the handwriting was uneven and soft, the ink almost gone in some places. He traced the lines with his fingers, feeling the history behind every mark. He could almost see Thomas Harper sitting at his piano, writing those notes for the woman he loved, and Evelyn waiting nearby, smiling with the kind of love that never fades. He closed his eyes and imagined her playing it again. The gentle rhythm, the trembling hands, the emotion that filled each imperfect sound. He realized he couldn't let the world forget it. He couldn't let that love story vanish, not when it had touched so many hearts. So he made a decision. He would record Clara's waltz, just as she had played it, not polished or changed, but real, raw, and alive. The maestro gathered his students one afternoon, and they helped him prepare the small hall. They placed Evelyn's old piano in the center of the room, exactly where she had played it. It still looked the same, scratched, worn, and full of character. When the light hit its wood, it almost seemed to glow again, as if it remembered the touch of her hands. Her grandson arrived carrying a small photograph of Evelyn and Thomas. Smiling in their youth, he placed it gently on the piano. Right beside the sheet of music, the maestro nodded respectfully. "Let her be here with us," he said softly. The room was silent except for the gentle hum of the recording equipment. The maestro sat before the piano, but he didn't play yet. He rested his hands on the keys and whispered, "Forgive me if I don't play it like you, Mrs. Harper, but I'll do my best to feel it the way you did." Then he began to play. The first notes came out hesitant, trembling, just like Evelyn's had. But soon the melody filled the room again, soft, warm, and full of heart. The maestro's usual precision was gone, replaced by something deeper, something real. His students watched in silence, tears in their eyes, because they could hear her in the music. She was there, in every note, in every pause, in every gentle mistake. When the final chord faded, the room stayed quiet for a long time. No one dared to speak. Finally, the maestro looked up and said quietly, "We'll call this recording Grandma's Piano the Lost Waltz." The students nodded, and Evelyn's grandson wiped his eyes, smiling through his tears. "She would have loved that," he said. Weeks later, the recording was shared online. The maestro didn't expect much, just a few listeners, maybe a few kind comments, but what happened next surprised everyone. The world fell in love with Grandma's piano. People from every corner of the world listened and cried. The comments flooded in. "This song feels like home," one person wrote. "It reminds me of my grandmother," said another. "I don't know who played this, but it made me call my mother and tell her I love her," wrote another. The maestro sat in his office reading those messages with tears in his eyes. He had performed in grand halls, won countless awards, and taught hundreds of students. Yet nothing had ever touched people's hearts like this one old song played on a broken piano by a loving woman. The story spread everywhere, newspapers wrote about it, calling it the song that made the world cry. Musicians spoke about Evelyn Harper, the unknown woman whose music had reminded the world what love truly sounded like. The maestro became known not for his perfection, but for his humility. He started every new lesson the same way, telling his students, "Perfection is for machines. Emotion is for humans. Don't chase applause. Chase truth." And when students struggled, he no longer raised his voice. He would simply say, "Play it like Mrs. Harper would. Play it with your heart." The music school changed too. The once polished walls were now decorated with photos of Evelyn, her piano, and the handwritten sheet of Clara's waltz. In one corner of the room, her old piano stood proudly, cleaned but not restored, just as she wanted it. Its scratches and faded marks were kept untouched. Every year, the maestro held a small concert in her honor, where his students played songs of love, memory, and courage. One evening after a long class, the maestro stayed alone in the room. He walked up to Evelyn's piano and sat down. He placed his hands on the keys and whispered, "You were right, Mrs. Harper. Love doesn't die. It only waits for someone to play its tune again." He played softly, letting the notes drift through the quiet hall. Outside, the night was calm, and the stars shimmered as if they too were listening. In that moment, he understood something powerful. That Evelyn's music wasn't just a love story between her and Thomas. It was a love story between humanity and the music of the soul. It was proof that even when people are gone, the feelings they leave behind can live forever through sound. And so in that little music school, the legacy of a humble grandmother and her old piano continued to breathe. Her song became a reminder to everyone who heard it that love, when true, never fades, it only waits. In silence, in memory, and in the music that touches hearts long after the hands that played it are gone. The maestro smiled, wiping a tear from his cheek. "Rest well, Evelyn," he whispered. "Your music will never be forgotten." The room stayed quiet, but the air felt alive. The piano sat under the soft glow of the lamp, a symbol of love that had outlived time itself. And somewhere, maybe far beyond the stars, Evelyn and Thomas were dancing again to the soft, eternal sound of Clara's waltz.